I'm going to discuss with y'all today about seagrass monitoring within the Gulf of Mexico. And essentially, we might be asking ourselves, what exactly are seagrasses? And so for those of you that might not be familiar with the seagrasses here along the coastlines, they are marine flowering plants, and they can form these very vast and continuous meadows, or sparse meadows, or maybe even patchy meadows along many coastlines worldwide. And those are indicated here in green. And so seagrasses provide many ecosystem services, and essentially those are services that we, or maybe habitat, fauna, will benefit from. And essentially they provide food for many charismatic species. So here we have this lovely green sea turtle munching on some turtle grass, or even manatees. They provide habitat for many commercially and recreationally fished species. So maybe scallops, or if y'all are avid fisher people, redfish are always fun to catch. And then of course, they also provide an aesthetic value. So here we can see this snorkeler that is enjoying the seagrass beds in the lower Laguna Madre of Texas. In addition to these services, they also sequester and uptake carbon from our atmosphere and from the water. They facilitate particle trapping by wave attenuation. So their blades essentially attenuate and dampen the waves. Particles are able to settle in the sea floor within the beds and the canopies. And then that facilitates carbon deposition. And then ultimately, after long timescales, carbon burial. So seagrasses, in addition to many other coastal habitats, and here we have maybe salt marshes, mangroves, these beautiful kelp forests, they take in a lot of carbon, and much of this is stored in their above ground biomass. So there may be blades, their leaves, their stems, and here we can see the difference in above ground carbon of these different types of habitats. But what's interesting is that seagrasses have a proportionally high sequestration rate relative to some of these other habitats. But ultimately, they are all very important carbon sinks. So why monitor seagrasses? Well, seagrasses have been referenced as the canary in a coal mine. And essentially what this means is that they are a sentinel species. So a sentinel species is any sort of animal or plant that serve as an indicator of change, which could be maybe danger to human health or the environment. And so here we have a picture of a canary that they used to be kept in coal mines, and essentially they were very sensitive to the odorless gas carbon monoxide. And unfortunately and tragically, they passed away, but that allowed time for the miners to realize that there was danger and escape the mine. So seagrasses, as these sentinel species, these indicators of potential changes, unfortunately have been doing their job and indicating to us that there are disturbances that may be negatively affecting them, or in some cases maybe positively affecting them, or maybe there is no change. And in this figure here, we are showing the number of studies, where red indicates the number of studies reporting decreases in seagrass loss. And we can see along most coastlines worldwide, there have been substantial reports of loss. And these losses are attributed to a variety of stressors that can include eutrophication, so that's an excess of nutrients into the water body. And here that might fuel tiny microalgae, so things like phytoplankton, which is giving this water this super crazy green hue. They can also facilitate the growth of macroalgae. So those are larger algae species, so maybe something like this drift algae over here. And then other human-induced disturbances or anthropogenic disturbances might include propeller scarring, where the props actually physically rip the seagrasses out of the substrate, leaving these very divoted bare patches. Or maybe it's from boat mooring, where we can see after these mooring of these vessels over time, the scour from the differences in the wave action and the boats themselves will scour the sediments and maybe remove the seagrasses or block light for the seagrasses. And then additionally, there's different sorts of natural disturbances. So those might be hurricanes, where we might see the erosion of sediment, therefore exposing the seagrasses. So in this image, the rhizomes, so these horizontal stems, are pretty much exposed. Or maybe we'll see burial, and the sediments might cover a substantial part of the blade, which could reduce photosynthesis. Drought might also be an issue, which could lead to higher salinities, so more salty water, and then a variety of other factors that might be involved with that, such as decreasing oxygen, warming waters, which is actually seen here in this image, where these extreme marine heat waves are warming ocean temperatures in certain areas, and the seagrasses that aren't equipped to tolerate these disturbances, unfortunately, might perish. So before they tragically perish, they elicit different responses to these certain stressors. And that initially starts off with changes in their physiology, which then might lead to alterations in their morphology. And then finally, if those conditions persist, changes at the meadow scale. And in this particular example, seagrasses, as photosynthetic plants, they require high light in order to photosynthesize and grow. And when light is blocked, maybe by, in this particular example, there was a flood. And so this plume, as you can see in this image, has brought in a lot of sediments. And so what the sediments do is that they end up blocking the light that penetrates down to the seagrasses. And so what might happen in this particular case is that under no light deprivation in this higher light area, seagrasses might be growing perfectly fine. When conditions start to get less ideal, light starts to decrease, we might see changes in their biochemical components, such as maybe carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Then again, we might lead into those differences in morphology. So that could be maybe they end up losing and shortening their leaves. They decrease in their number of leaves per shoot. Maybe they grow taller, maybe they grow wider. And then over time, if those light requirements, for example, are not met and it continues to decrease, we might ultimately see mortality and decline of the individual plant. And what that might look at the meadow scale, so the larger scale, is that we might see shifts in species composition, or we might see shifts in the substrate. So we might go from vegetated to unvegetated and anoxic, meaning no oxygen or muddy substrates. So how can we reverse these declines that have been reported throughout the world? And that's where monitoring can really come into play and help us meet conservation needs. And what this image is showing is that in these black areas, all along these coastlines around many parts of the world are long-term monitoring programs. And so oftentimes these programs might follow a tiered framework. And what this means is that at the lowest tier, so at tier 1, this is typically acquired imagery, maybe from airplanes or satellite imagery. And ultimately you can characterize the distribution and extent of seagrasses. So here is an image from an airplane that I was in, where you can really, at this scale, see the changes and the differences in the patch dynamics. So is it a continuous full bed? Are there some patches here and there? Then at the tier 2 level, this is where it's also a rapid survey, but it's more regional. And this is where you can really start to get at assessing the condition and then quantifying these stressor response relationships between the seagrass and, say, maybe light or nutrient addition. And an example of a measurement would be percent cover, for example, where percent cover means the proportion of this frame that is obscured by vegetation. And then lastly, the most intensive sampling is tier 3. And this might entail collecting some biomass cores. And this really helps you get and diagnose those causal relationships between the stressor and the seagrass. So what might that look like? And in this particular example here, we have an image where the dark coloring represents seagrass coverage. So this would be at the tier 1 landscape level. Then you would have a tier 2 region over here shown in blue and this hashed line area. And that might consist of these large hexagons, maybe like with 500-meter edges, where you would have one sampling station in each of these hexagons. And then nested within tier 1, the landscape, and then this regional survey, tier 2, you'll have maybe one site that you would sample, say maybe different transects along this site. And in this schematic, this is a 50-meter transect with 10 underwater PVC poles. And so at this sampling, one might collect some percent cover observations and some biomass samples. And maybe even further, maybe they start to look at the sediment composition, like sediment grain size, sediment ammonium. So this is your very intensive sampling. So going back to that figure, today I'm really going to focus on talking about one program that I'm really familiar with that Dr. Ken Dunton started in 2011 here in Texas, and that's the Texas Seagrass Monitoring Program. And then I'm also going to touch base on some of the findings from 2 other programs in Florida, which I will discuss in a little bit. So in 2011, as I mentioned, this program was started, and at that time, they were currently surveying around 94% of the seagrasses, which is a substantial amount along the Texas coast. And that really ranges from where we are at here along the coastal bend, so around Port Aransas or so, down to the Mexico-Texas border, so like South Padre Island. But more recently, within the last couple of years, with the help of colleagues from Texas Parks and Wildlife and the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, we are now surveying 100% of the seagrasses. So we're pretty excited about that. And that is a large endeavor. So it takes many, many people and great collaborative partners like we have. And so these are the areas where we're pretty much sampling. We got Galveston Bay, so Christmas and West Bays, and we got Matagorda Bay, San Antonio Bay, and then what we were previously monitoring here in the Mission Aransas National Estuarine Research Reserve, Corpus Christi Bay, Upper Laguna Madre, and Lower Laguna Madre. So what I want to play for y'all next is a video really summarizing what we do in the Texas Seagrass Monitoring Program.
I do. I think this is a really important project in that no one's ever looked at the whole state, you know, our seagrass beds, and to see if there's any, you know, if there's major changes or over time, you know, what's going on in our bays. It's real important, especially what I see in the last few years. There's so many more boaters, there's so many more people out on the water, in the grass bed, enjoying, you know, the fishing, you know, just being outside. That it's important for us to know what's going on so that we can protect it, you know, if it needs to be protected.
Our statewide monitoring extends from Cedar Bayou in the north to Lower Laguna Madre in the south. Northern sites are funded by the Mission Aransas NERM. Corpus Christi Bay sites are funded by Congdon Basin Estuaries Program. National Park Service funds stations in Padre Island National Seashore, and the GLO funds Lower Laguna Madre. And without these partnerships, this project wouldn't be possible.
And so with this monitoring program, we're really able to start to investigate some of these, and not just our monitoring program, obviously, there's many more, as we saw in some of those previous figures throughout the entire world, but really start to try to better understand how maybe some of these extreme climate disturbances, whether they're natural in this particular case, or they are anthropogenic, so human induced, how they alter the communities, the seagrass communities, and even the seagrass associated fauna. So switching gears a little bit, we are going to now really delve into some of the reported responses to extreme climate disturbances. And this has really recently taken off, and this is like, you know, this is due to climate change. And so with the more frequent and more intense maybe storms and climate, other types of climate regimes that we're getting, we are starting to understand how seagrasses respond to that and what they're telling us, as we previously mentioned, being sentinel species. So here we have temperature as a function of month. And really what we're looking at is in this black line, this black dotted line, is the mean ocean temperature between 1995 and 2014. And these other blue lines are just the other years in between this time frame. But what's interesting is that there's this red line, and that is for 2011. And this coincided, these warm temperatures, specifically here, which reached over 30 and 30 degrees Celsius. And what that translates to roughly is around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So that is extremely toasty. Corresponded to a marine heat wave. And so how did the seagrasses respond, to this intense temperature? Well, this is actually, I forgot to mention, in Australia, so Shark Bay. But here in 1987 and 2010, it might be a little difficult to see, this dark colored within this white polygon is the seagrass. And so there's maybe slight changes in between this time frame, but not substantial changes. But then in 2011, when that marine heat wave was reported and those temperatures really warmed, they found a significant decline in seagrasses within this area. And more importantly, that this also propagated to the fauna as well. So and there are differences in the faunal responses. So, and that is mainly due to how closely tied they were with the habitat. So for example, this tiger shark and maybe these loggerheads don't really prey on species within seagrass habitat, or spend a lot of time there or eat species from there. So maybe that's why they did not detect any declines. But some of these other species, maybe particularly some of these invertebrates, like the scallops, which are really seagrass focused, we saw decline, or they saw declines in those species. And so other than, say, for the example, the marine heat waves that we spoke about, there's also droughts and hurricanes. And droughts, obviously you don't have to live along the Texas coast to experience a drought, as if y'all are from Texas and other parts of the world, you're probably, unfortunately, quite familiar with them. But here's an image from Lake Travis in Austin, where water levels, even this was taken a little bit after some rainfall, were still significantly below normal. And interestingly, 2010 to 2015 was the longest drought in Texas, which is approximately about 271 weeks. So that was a really intense and exceptional drought. Then in 2017, we were hit, not just Texas, but much of the US was hit with multiple hurricanes. And 2017 actually ranked third on the record for the most major hurricanes. And essentially the three, Harvey, Irma, and Maria, totaled up to 265 billion worth in damages. So what are some of the consequences of drought? We know that if that drought, it's drier, it's hotter, so temperatures are warming, there's less precipitation and rainfall, there's more evaporation. And this is from the US Drought Monitor. And what this shows is the proportion of the state, this is of Texas, in different levels of drought over time. And so essentially these yellows are these abnormally dry periods. And then these dark maroons and reds are the exceptional and extreme droughts. And we could see that it kind of comes and it goes, 2006 to 7 was pretty big, 8 to 10. And then from, as we had previously mentioned, the end of 2010 to 2015, we have this really significant drought period. And so we mentioned some of the things that drought does, but it also, along some of these bays, so we have a bunch of linked lagoons here, it increases the salinity. So it increases the salt in these areas. And here We have salinity over time, and this is in the upper Laguna Madre, which is one of 6 or 7, I believe, of the most hypersaline, so really salty lagoons in the world. But just to provide a frame of reference, 35 is about average seawater. And we can see that starting in 2011, I'm sorry, you can't really see that color show up too well, but around 2012 and 13, salinity values start to creep up to around 50, mid-50s, the mean. And we even have some up to 70 and exceeding 70. I remember we were out in the field seeing 80 and more. So that is extremely salty. And in order to live in this sort of environment, you need to have certain adaptations that allow you to live there. And some species might be better equipped to live in those environments than others. And so maybe on the flip side, looking at some of the potential implications of hurricanes, maybe there's a lot of flooding that's involved. Like with Hurricane Harvey in Houston, it dumped a ton of rain over there. And then you got storm surges that are also bringing in maybe the ocean water. So you have fresh water, you got ocean water. You have maybe wind damage where winds are just ripping up everything in its path. Maybe even beach erosion, where you'll see that in this image, the sediment has just been completely removed. And so ultimately, these long-term monitoring programs, specifically in Texas, the Texas Seagrass Monitoring Program, and then in Florida, the Florida Fisheries Habitat Assessment Program, which are these orange or these pink kind of hexagons, and the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, these black dots. They have done studies on some of these disturbances and on the effects that they have on seagrasses. And although there's 5 common seagrass species in Texas and 6 in the Gulf of Mexico, which are widgeon grass, stargrass, shoalgrass, manatee grass, and turtle grass, I'm really going to focus on 3 of them. And they are the shoalgrass, manatee grass, and turtle grass. And so as I previously mentioned, we saw starting in late 2010 to 11 and then on, much of the state was covered in an exceptional drought. And what Wilson and Dunton found, here we're looking at the cover, the percent cover of manatee grass, where these warm colors indicate higher amounts of cover, and then these cool colors, these blues, represent low color cover. That in 2013, we see a substantial decline. So something happened, and in this case, it correlated with the drought. And then a couple of years later, we start to see a little bit of an increase in some of these areas. Then Hall et al. In 2016 documented another massive decline of turtle grass in Florida Bay. And Florida Bay is unfortunately not a stranger to these huge declines in seagrasses. They've happened a couple of times throughout the decades. And what we're looking at here is these once dense beds. This is all dead leaf material that is floating and that has just died and ripped off of the basal parts, the bottom part of the plant. And this was linked to warming temperatures from the drought, which then facilitated many other like the cascade effect involving other factors such as the warming water temperatures, the low dissolved oxygen in the water column, and then a buildup of sediments, sulfide in the sediments. And so in 2010, as we previously discussed, we had Harvey. It came and unfortunately struck our Texas coast. And what we found was it was a very patchy response in some areas. Turtle grass was completely stripped and removed from the substrate. As we can see here, this is actually the below ground, so the stuff that's hiding in the sediments that really anchors the plant in. So these are decaying and broken roots and rhizomes from the turtle grass. And then we also saw these clipped blades, which were essentially most likely sheared at the sediment surface, almost as if you kind of went over them with a lawnmower. And then Irma hit Florida, and Wilson et al. Also found some similar findings where seagrasses, the turtle grass, maybe there was erosion, there was burial, and that most of this action, this physical action, happened in the Lower Keys area. So how can we assess seagrass condition? And how we did that was you put a bunch of mad scientists in a room for many days and deliberated very intensely about which indicators to measure in order to evaluate seagrass condition. And you got to keep in mind that this is along the entire Gulf of Mexico, so it covers very different habitats, from maybe clear waters in Florida to the very turbid, murky waters in Texas, different types of sediment, carbonate, shelly sediments versus maybe muds and clays. And so we all got together and we really drilled down over here, like 90 indicators that have been proposed by other researchers, these great reviews, and these all are wonderful indicators and they all do work. So it was our job to whittle those down into the most influential, the most commonly measured, the most cost effective, which is really important, easy to interpret. And those were some of the factors that we considered when we started selecting and narrowing down these indicators. And what we ended up coming down to were roughly 10 indicators total, and some dealt with water quality, and then some are seagrass, and then some are fauna. But for today, I'm really going to focus on on 4 of the seagrass-centric indicators, and that is cover. And so we actually had 2 different cover points, and that was greater than 50% cover, because here in Texas, we have very dense beds, which are well over 50%, and then less than 50%. And those might be for other portions, like even in Galveston Bay, for example, they have relatively maybe low cover, and then in areas in Florida as well. We also looked at diversity. So there's several species in the Gulf of Mexico, and we focused on really 3 of the dominant ones, and that was the turtle grass, the shoal grass, and the manatee grass, and their relative proportions in, at that particular site that we were investigating. And then we also looked at leaf morphology. So leaf length, how long the blade was, and then width, so how wide. And so for each one of those indicators, we needed to derive some thresholds or assessment points. And then that allowed us to assign a condition rating. So whether it's good, poor, or fair, for example. And here's a schematic that really is just kind of showing and explaining the assessment points. So for a good condition rating, this would be a set of values that would be indicative of a very pristine or a good condition state, or something that we would want to, that's essentially desirable. A fair assessment point is starting to get at the warning part. So there's something going on. The conditions are now starting to slide back. They're starting to degrade a little bit. And then you have at poor, where it is severely degraded, might be imminent loss, depending on maybe the disturbance type. If it's natural, it might come back over some time. If they're chronic stressors, maybe of water quality, then that might be a more severe issue. Now, using the data from those long-term monitoring programs And then the indicators and those ranges of values that we set up for each of those indicators, we're able to come up with the score. So green, I apologize if these colors are a little difficult to see, but green is good. It's a stoplight scheme. Fair is yellow and red is poor. And so looking at the Upper Laguna Madre in Texas, in relation to the drought, over the time frame where the drought, we know the drought occurred, 2012, 13, and 14, what we see is that there were changes starting to get initiated in leaf length in 2012, and then again in 2013, as well as diversity becomes affected. And then by 2014, you start to see changes in the cover and then diversity as well. Then looking at the hurricane in the coastal bend, so where Harvey hit in 2017, what we see is that all three of those indicators were affected. So we saw differences in the cover, in the diversity, and in the leaf length from the previous year. So then shifting gears to Florida Bay, looking at two of those basins over there, Johnson Key Basin and then Rankin Lake. Again, looking at the drought, which were reported in 2016, 2015. We see that diversity, leaf length were affected in both Johnson and Rankin. And then we also had cover as well the following year. And then even some changes in leaf width. And then finally, looking at the hurricane in the Florida Key area, specifically at Lower Key Bayside. We also detected declines in cover, and we also noticed changes in leaf length as well immediately following the hurricane. And so just to kind of summarize those relationships that we saw, in Texas, in response to the drought, cover decreased, diversity also decreased, and that was due to the loss of manatee grass, which was reported in Wilson and Dutton. And then we also saw declines in leaf length, which was attributed to the loss of Serengodium, as it is typically a much longer leaf species than shoalgrass. Then looking at drought in Florida Bay, we also saw a reduction in cover, which was mainly driven by the turtle grass, as we saw in those previous pictures. And again, with the diversity, a decrease, which was attributed as well to the turtle grass loss. We actually saw an increase in leaf length and a decrease in leaf width. So ultimately, as we previously discussed earlier on in this presentation, that changes can vary. And that's why our indicators can either increase or decrease. And ultimately, it's that relative change that we're interested in. And that is what is telling us that something is going on. And so in Texas, following the hurricane, a decrease in cover indicated by the loss of turtle grass, which also affected the diversity, so decline in diversity, and then also a reduction in leaf length. And as we remember, we saw those kind of cropped blades at the sediment surface. Looking at Florida, again, another decline in cover. The diversity was around the same or slightly increased. And then leaf length also decreased. So the great news is that we are one of the groups, as well as several others, that have been really looking at developing this Gulf-wide framework for assessing seagrass condition and trends throughout the entire Gulf of Mexico. And ultimately, with all of our efforts, our hope is that we can provide the science to resource managers and to the public in order to protect and conserve our seagrasses. And so I know earlier I started off kind of very doom and gloomy with a lot of the declines, the habitat declines of seagrasses, but it's not all bad. And there have been really great success stories. And one is in Chesapeake Bay, for example, where the average phosphorus and nitrogen, so those nutrients that were entering the watershed, they were decreased over time due to management efforts. And with that reduction in nutrients into the bay, what they found over time was that seagrasses started to increase. So that was great news. And they're not the only ones that have experienced this success. For example, in Tampa Bay, in the late 80s, they realized we have some substantial declines of our seagrass habitat. They also initiated some management of nutrient inputs into the bays. And then over time, they actually ended up meeting their seagrass recovery goal. So with management efforts to really start to try to control the amount of nutrients that are allowed to enter the watersheds, we might see, we will see actually in most areas, increases in water quality, so clearer waters, which then help allow seagrasses to grow better. However, there are also restoration efforts, which is good. So in areas where maybe we've lost seagrass, we can potentially try to restore. The downside is that if we look here at this figure, we have the cumulative number of restoration projects, where green is the total amount, blue is the total amount of projects, and red are the successful projects. And we can see that there's definitely a lot of restoration projects, which is great. The success rates aren't as well. But this is a great example over here of a successful restoration project where they had planted plots and there were some previous existing seagrasses. And then over time, the seagrasses started to fill in. So ultimately, the best way to avoid seagrass loss and to conserve is prevention. And that can be done through initiatives and then education. So here, for example, we have the Texas Parks and Wildlife. This reminding people that there is no crop scarring. So in a previous figure I showed those big motors were ripping up the seagrasses. And with the great recreational fishing that we can do here along the coast, seagrasses typically grow in these shallow bodies of water. Fish and other invertebrates love the seagrass habitat. So if we can have boats that go in that habitat, that shallow, skinny habitat, that's great. But the problem is that sometimes it gets really skinny quickly, or maybe it's an experienced boater. And if they do not lift their prop, they do not drift over the area or pole or troll, they might uproot seagrasses. So they really tried to educate people, and unfortunately too, there is a fine associated with it. So then there's also, how can you communicate and convey these findings to the general public? And Chesapeake Bay has done a really nice example of providing these report cards. So essentially what they do is like very much like you're in school, you get an A, B, C, D, or F. That is how the health is of that particular ecosystem is graded. So maybe it's seagrasses in that particular area. And essentially what you can see here are certain regions that might be doing better, like here in the lower bay, than others. So maybe back up over here. And then you can also be a citizen scientist. So there's several programs, maybe some close to where you're at, maybe some very far away, maybe some hopefully more in the future. But for example, if you enjoy outdoors and you're just really interested in the environment and what's going on in your backyard, if you're an amateur scientist and you want to get out there, there's several programs where you can go out and monitor seagrasses. And here, or maybe even the water quality. So for example, in Rockport, Texas, in Little Bay, there is a community-driven project to where they go out and they monitor water quality. And a lot of people can do it if they live in that area and maybe a canal home, they can just do it from there. A lot of people maybe drive up to the water and collect samples, but it's a great way to really learn and understand what is going on in your backyard. And then there's other programs like Seagrass Watch, which is global in certain areas, and you get to work and collaborate with other scientists, and you get trained and you get to go out there and also sample. Sarasota Seagrass, so in Florida, this is actually an annual seagrass survey that citizen scientists get to do. So again, it really gets you involved, it gets maybe the kids involved, and you just are more aware and familiar with what's going on. And then you can also go to Seagrass Spotter, and if you are out maybe on vacation somewhere and you want to know what what type of seagrass that is, you can go to this website, you can upload pictures, and you can learn more about other seagrasses. But wait, there's more. So like an infomercial. Maybe seagrasses aren't your thing, which is totally fine. There's other sorts of citizen scientist programs like the Nerdle Patrol, which is done here at the Mission Aransas NER with Jace Tunnel. And essentially they, in this particular graphic, you go out to the beach, you collect these nurdles, which are these little virgin plastic pellets that they use to make larger plastic products, unfortunately. And there's a specific protocol, and you go out and you collect, and then you report your findings, which are shown here on this map. And additionally too, if maybe your kids or your friends are interested and you're watching this and you know people, they also have science programs. So down here during the summer, before COVID, we had these awesome science programs where kids get to work with fellow scientists and really get down and dirty and in the weeds and learn about the environment and stimulate, you know, their curiosity. And then maybe the marine environment isn't for you. Maybe you're landlocked. I used to live in Lockhart, Texas, so I know how that is. There's a bunch of other citizen scientist programs that you can do where you can monitor maybe monarch butterflies or birds and etc. So the options, there's definitely options for everybody. And I think, yeah, with that, there are a lot of people that have worked on this project that I would spend forever thinking. So thank them, and then our funding and sponsored agencies.
All right, Victoria, thank you so much. We do actually have several questions, if you're up for taking a few.
Okay. And
so I'm going to start you off with a difficult one that I have a feeling you're going to give us a lot of "it depends" answers. So what is the maximum depth at which Texas seagrass is found? And of the Texas seafloor at that depth or shallower, what percentage is covered, at least in part, by seagrass?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So seagrasses in Texas, if you've been and you've seen our water, that video that I actually showed, that was here in Texas. And I'm pretty sure some of y'all are probably like, are those seagrasses? Like, it's so difficult to see. The water quality is a little bit more turbid than maybe areas like Florida. Or southern Florida, I should say, because there's even some areas in Florida that are a little bit more turbid. So in Texas, the maximum depth typically is about 2 meters, so 6 feet. We rarely see seagrasses grow at greater depths along our coastline than that. And really, they at that point, they start to get very sparse. So you don't really get the dense, full meadows. You get kind of just maybe a couple of individual plants that are surviving and thriving and somehow making it down there. So yes, 2 meters, so 6 feet is kind of the max here. And then the proportion of the substrate, really in a lot of our areas along the shallow waters, so I'd say anywhere less than a meter or so, like around there, a meter, you can typically find seagrasses. So there is a substantial part along the Texas coast that is just covered in seagrasses. And then once you get deeper, than that 2 meter mark, like we discussed, in those open bays, those deep bays and those channels and stuff like that, you won't find them. But yeah, you will find them in a lot of shallower waters along the inner lagoons. So in Texas too, I don't think I mentioned this, and it was maybe hard to see on my figures, but we have a bunch of linked lagoons, which are in between the mainland and then the barrier islands. And so between those lagoons, that's where you're really gonna find those dense seagrass beds. So yeah.
Okay, so any preliminary data or hypotheses, or we'll take an educated guess about the effects of the recent freeze on Texas seagrasses?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because again, that freeze was crazy, and we saw what it did to our plants, right? Our poor plants and landscape and everything died. So the seagrasses you can find in all the way up to the Arctic Circle. So they are pretty well equipped to deal with some temperature changes. And the water, although it did get cold down here, it didn't, like freeze or anything like that. And even if it would have, it definitely still would have buffered below the ice, so the seagrasses would be fine. So seagrasses, as far as the temperature, the really low temperatures, we think that for the most part, that they probably fared okay. It might have delayed. So during the winter, seagrasses start to, so during the seasons, they kind of have a seasonal growth. So in the summer, they reach peak growth, and then by fall, they start to decline just naturally. It's just how it is with decreases in sunlight and then temperatures and stuff like that. And then in winter, they start to senesce, so they lose their leaves, but the below ground tissue is still present. And then again in the spring, the below ground reserves start to pump up the energy and get the leaves growing again. So the freeze might have maybe delayed, or maybe some leaves might have been lost or something like that. But I don't think we're going to see any crazy drastic effects like we did on other sorts of vegetation. So like black mangroves, which all the leaves were completely brown, and there's actually a lot of field work happened to see kind of what and evaluate those effects. So I think seagrasses fared okay.
Okay, and good job, because you just actually answered a question about mangroves in that answer as well. So you hit 2 out of the park.
Awesome.
Seagrass have a natural predator, such as a species of fish that is a threat to seagrass, or is it just us?
Yeah, that is great. It is actually just us. It's what we end up unfortunately doing to our watersheds and impairing the water quality and stuff like that. Fish actually are good for seagrasses, because, so I showed a quick image earlier on about the microalgae and then like the drift algae. And so those microalgae, sometimes they'll grow on the seagrass blade, and those are called epiphytes. So those communities might be little tiny plants, they might be animals. But they start to colonize the seagrass blades. And that's great, right? Because they provide habitat for other organisms, they provide food for other organisms. But when epiphytes get a little crazy and out of control, and you'll see that in some of the areas where there's maybe a lot of nutrients coming into the water, they will reduce and hinder the photosynthetic ability of the seagrass. So epiphytes can hurt the seagrass if in excessive abundance, but fish might help in the fact that they can, if they see some epiphytes that they like and make a little meal out of them, they can help kind of clean them and pick at them, just like amphipods, which are these tiny little crustaceans that clean seagrasses, and they're called mesograzers, and there's other types of snails and gastropods and all this stuff, but those are all great because they can help maintain the growth of these epiphytes. And then you got big megafauna, right? So turtles. I mean, there's been studies where when turtles were in decline, now with all the conservation, they've increased and they just will munch away at those seagrasses. But it also maintains them and it helps them grow. So anyways, to get back a very long answer to your question, I think we, as Sarah mentioned, are probably the worst animals that mess with seagrasses.
Okay, and so you talked a little bit about this, but I wonder if you could expand. So you were talking about the different effects of hurricanes. So we had the wind with Hurricane Harvey, and Houston had the rain, lots and lots of rain, which obviously dropped the salinity quite a bit in the upper Texas coast. So which was the greater detriment to seagrass, in your opinion?
God, that is
what does your data suggest?
Yeah, that's a really great data. And so unfortunately, we have not looked at those data yet because those are data from up north. So those would be more the Galveston Bay seagrasses, the Matagorda Bay, even the San Antonio Bay area. And that's actually something that I want to do because I am curious to see how did it alter those communities? Because as you had mentioned, a lot of heavy rainfall up there lowers the salinities. Some seagrasses can tolerate, just like we talked about, high salinities. Some are better at tolerating the lower salinities. Some are not. Luckily, the species that are up there are really weedy, hardy species. So the shoal grass and even that widgeon grass. So unfortunately, I don't know the answer, but previous studies have shown that flood events, unfortunately, also result in severe declines of seagrasses. So it would not surprise me if we did lose some seagrasses up there.